I've been wondering for days, what is it that I can do to help the freedom movement in Cuba, and all that I can come up with is this video. I feel like most of the media is not doing the Cuba issue justice, and Cubans have been without freedom for 62 years, so most of the population in Cuba doesn't know what it's like to live in freedom. And this is an important moment because this is the first time in those 62 years that there's massive protests in Cuba, and we can't let them die down. I'm not sure how, but somehow we have to help them. So I'm going to try to help by spreading awareness of the truth of what's happening in Cuba. Cubans are fed up. They're fed up of being in a totalitarian communist dictatorship. They have no freedom of speech. They have no right to protest, and they haven't been able to choose a president in 62 years. Everything in Cuba is government owned, so from like the kiosk on the corner to all of the land, all of the food, the distribution of food, the places where they sell the food, and not just food but just basically everything that exists in the island is government owned. Obviously the media is also government owned. They don't have free press. Every television channel, every radio station, every newspaper, everything is controlled by the communist dictatorship. With social media, Cubans are finally able to see how people live on the outside world, and they're seeing that they've been lied to their whole lives. From the time we start kindergarten in Cuba, we are taught about socialism and communism. They teach us to praise the free healthcare and education in Cuba, which by the way is not that good. Currently, hospitals and clinics in Cuba are so bad that people are scared to get sick and have to need to go to a hospital or a clinic because there's a higher chance of infection there. The education's a little harder to explain, but basically you can't study whatever you want. They have specific slots of things that they have available, and it's only for a few people with really good grades that are able to like move on and study. Not everybody can go to university in Cuba. That is a lie. But you have to become part of the Communist Party in order to like even go to school, otherwise you can't. And after you graduate, you have to basically work for free for 2 years, so it's not free, you're paying it back. But anyways, from the time that we are kids and we are at school, they teach us that imperialist Americans are bad and that they want to come and invade us. They teach us that Americans want to come and take our freedom. Honestly, having lived here for 14 years now, I know that Americans couldn't give less of a shit about Cuba, especially with what's going on right now. Like, no support at all whatsoever, if that doesn't tell you something. On TV, they show us how people in Africa live and how they are dying, to show us that we should be thankful for the Cuban Revolution and how they keep us free from American invaders. With social media and access to internet, which in Cuba they've only had for 5 to 10 years, it's been very slowly being more accessible to Cubans, to the Cubans that can pay for it anyways. Cubans have basically now been able to see what the outside world really is like, and they want freedom. There's been a lot of misinformation going around, and I want to be clear, Cubans are not asking for the end of the embargo. Cubans are asking for freedom. I want to show you guys the next few slides because I think that these are so important. The United States imposed an embargo against the communist island in 1960, which consists of economic sanction against Cuba and restrictions on Cuba travel and commerce for all people and companies under US jurisdiction. Cuba has never met the US conditions for lifting the embargo. The embargo will be terminated under these conditions. Cuba must legalize all political activity. Cuba must release all political prisoners, which are over 70,000 people now. Cuba must commit to free and fair elections in the transition to representative democracy. Cuba must grant freedom to the press. Cuba must respect internationally recognized human rights, and Cuba must allow labor unions. The Cuban people are asking for this, for freedom, for human rights. I think it's pretty clear the embargo is not the issue. The embargo enables the US to apply pressure on the Cuban government to improve human rights. The embargo can be lifted today, and Cuba will still have no human rights. Cuba needs change and needs it now. The embargo is not responsible for prohibiting fishermen from fishing. The dictatorship is. is. The embargo is not responsible for confiscating what farmers harvest. The dictatorship is. The embargo is not responsible from prohibiting Cubans on the island from doing business freely. The dictatorship is. The embargo is not responsible for destroying every sugar mill, textile factory, shoe store, canning factory. The dictatorship is. The embargo is not responsible for Cubans being paid in Cuban pesos while the regime sells everything in stores with American dollars. The dictatorship is. The embargo is not responsible for Cubans being beaten and imprisoned for thinking differently. The dictatorship is. The embargo is not responsible for sentencing hundreds of political prisoners who haven't committed any crime. The dictatorship is. The embargo was not responsible that while people outside the island were sending American dollars to their Cuban relatives through Western Union, yet the regime exchanged them for worthless Cuban convertible pesos. The dictatorship is. Basically, they keep all the dollars and they give people like a fake currency that they can then use to like buy things, but they take a percentage of the money. The embargo is not responsible that the dictatorship builds hotels while the roofs of the Cuban homes fall upon their heads. The dictatorship is. Basically, nobody's saying the embargo is a good idea. It is something that happened many years ago. It is super outdated. But what we are scared of is that if the embargo were to be lifted, the Cuban regime would most likely be able to continue to last for who knows how many more years. It's been 62 already. And they could continue to deprive all Cubans of their basic human rights. Because the Cuban people spoke up for the first time, our worst fears became a reality. There's hundreds and hundreds of people who are missing. They've been kidnapped. Their families don't know where they are. They were arrested by the Cuban regime and they are most likely taken outside of the city. The regime does not give their families information on where they are, and they weren't doing anything wrong. They were peacefully protesting on the streets. All you have to do is look up the hashtag SOS Cuba and you can see the images and the videos being shared of the horrible police brutality that is happening in Cuba right now. The regime's police is fully armed and in many cases shooting against unarmed peaceful protesters. There is people who have been wounded, there is people who have been killed, and like I said, there are hundreds of people missing for expressing their discontent with the regime, basically. And I heard that they're starting to do what they call speed trials or fast trials, which basically means that they're asking for 5 to 10 years in prison for these peaceful protesters. And right now it feels very helpless. I don't think they have right to an attorney, and if they do, it's probably going to be an attorney put there by the regime, which means it's like having no attorney at all. So we don't know what's going to happen to these hundreds of people who are currently missing and their family knows nothing of them. Cuban Americans are extremely hurt because our families have been divided for way too long, and this is the first true glimpse of hope that we see in 62 years. Growing up, my dad left Cuba when I was 3 years old. Obviously, at the time, I couldn't understand why it was happening, but it was literally the most traumatizing thing that's ever happened to me. He would call me weekly and he would, of course, send money to my grandparents so that they could buy food for me, so that we could eat, so that we could live a little bit of a better life inside of Cuba. Back then, we thought Cuba was bad, but trust me, it is nothing in comparison to what is happening right now. Every year, my dad would go to Cuba to see me. He would bring suitcases full of clothing, toys, and candy for me. And let me tell you, every August, for those 2 weeks, it was like Christmas to me. And I knew that I was privileged because I had lots of family and lots of friends that didn't have anyone on the outside to bring them clothes and send them money. And they had to always wear hand-me-downs or, you know, go around with broken clothes and broken shoes. Also, I remember growing up, whenever adults wanted to say anything negative about Cuban politics, even in a closed house in a living room to each other face to face, they would whisper it. That tells you how fearful people are, that even inside their house, in their own living rooms, talking to a friend, they had to whisper if they wanted to say anything negative, remotely negative, about the regime because they are scared. So the fact that this many people came out to fight for their rights can only tell you how fed up and how hungry Cubans are. Also, growing up, whenever my dad visited Cuba, we always went to the beach at least for a weekend, and I remember that Cubans had no right to stay inside hotels, but Cuban Americans did because they wanted the American dollars. So let's say my dad went to Cuba to see me and he wanted to rent a hotel room for me and him to stay in for a weekend. He wasn't able to do that. He could rent a hotel and he could stay in the all-inclusive hotel, but because I, his daughter, was Cuban and I hadn't left the country to live outside, I wasn't allowed in hotels. This changed when I was a teenager, and I think that recently I heard somewhere that they made it that way again, but I'm not sure about that. Anyways, growing up, me and my family, or any Cuban in the island, we couldn't stay in hotels in Cuba even if we had the money to pay for them. Hotels were exclusively for tourists. Also, I remember growing up when I was in school, we were kind of forced to like go to like march for like Cuban politics. They basically put you in a bus at school, they take you to like march for whatever, and after a few hours they put you back in the bus and take you back to school. If you don't do it, you are basically discriminated against. And it's the same thing to a much larger scale to people who work for the government, which is everybody in Cuba, because like I said, everything in Cuba is government owned. Basically, if you don't go to march for them, then you can get fired, plain and simple. I forgot to say something earlier about the embargo, and that is that Cuban still trades with the United States, and Cuban can trade with every single other country in the world. The only one that they can't fully trade with is the United States, and that the embargo does not include food or medicine. So if Cuba needs to buy food or medicine from the United States, they can, and they do. Tons and tons of it every year. The reason the Cuban economy is so bad is because everything is prohibited in Cuba, and they want to fully control every single aspect of everything that happens in Cuba. So for instance, people who plant crops, they can only sell those crops to the government at a price that the government fixes. And of course, the price that they want to pay for those crops is laughable. My great-grandfather, my grandma's dad, my grandma, who you guys met in a video recently, he had a farm in Cuba and he had trees with fruits, they had cane sugar, they had animals like pigs and chickens, and basically everything they produced in that farm they had to sell to the government. They can't sell it to like people in their neighborhood because they could go to prison for that. And he was working in his farm doing hard labor year round, and he could not make enough of a living, so he eventually had to sell the farm to the regime at, of course, the price that the regime fixed for his farm. And that farm is currently abandoned in Cuba because nobody wants to be a slave for the regime. That's why Cuba does not have food, because nobody wants to do free labor, basically. That's what my great-granddad was doing. He would get in debt to get the items that he needed to plant his crops, and then with what he could sell the crops for at the end of the year, he could only have enough money to pay that debt and not have anything left for him. Nobody wants to work like that. And that happened all throughout Cuba, and it's the same with fishermen. They can't sell their fish to anybody but the regime. They want to control everything, and Cubans simply cannot live freely. I'm sure that I am missing so much information from this video. I hate politics. This is not about politics. This is about human rights. The right to protest, the right to have your own opinion, of being able to speak your mind, and people in Cuba right now can't do that. I'm scared for the people who went out to protest and are currently missing. I'm scared that they'll never see their families again, and I'm scared that people are going to be scared of this happening to them and that they won't protest anymore, and that we will continue to have this horrible way of living happening in Cuba. I am scared that this was all for nothing, and we need help. because Cubans don't have weapons. Weapons have been illegal in Cuba for decades. So anybody who goes out and protest, and you guys can see it on the video again, I am asking you to go search hashtag SOS Cuba. You can see that they are fighting armed soldiers with sticks and stones. They're also being chased inside their homes. The people who they can recognize that protested and they didn't catch at the protest, they're going to their houses and they are getting them out of their houses to put them in prison. What can we do? Sharing the information. I'm sharing this video and I'm asking you guys to help me share things that I'm posting over on my Instagram account. I'm asking you to share Cuban voices and Cuban stories because Cubans deserve freedom. We deserve to be free. It's been way too long. Nobody in Cuba knows what it's like to be free. And by the way, all of this only applies to the common people of Cuba, because the people that run Cuba, they live lavishly and their family lives lavishly as well. We need human rights in Cuba. We need human rights organizations to get involved. So please help me in tagging the UN Human Rights, and every single other human rights organization that exists, and help Cubans fight for freedom. I guess that's all I have to say. I hope this video came out okay. Thank you guys so much for hearing me out, and I hope to see you in the next video.